Hi, and welcome to our conversation today, Regulatory Reporting with AI in Practice. I'm delighted to welcome our two fantastic guests for this informal conversation. We have David Lian and Peter Elkhouri, who will introduce themselves shortly. I'm John McCambridge, the Director of Financial Services, Insurance, and Finance Teams at Dataiku. And as you'll see through this conversation, just like my role at Dataiku, it's all about practical work and challenges and successes. So throughout this conversation, you're going to be hearing very much about what is actually happening in this space today and what is likely to happen in the short-term future. And the conversations that we'll be having today are going to be very much focused on practical applied work, ideally with concrete examples, perhaps anonymized when need be. And that's why we have such these two excellent speakers to join us today. So first, David, I'd ask you to introduce yourself, and then Peter.
Sure. So I'm David Lian. I'm the global head of financial reporting at Standard Chartered. I've been at Standard Chartered for nearly a decade now, and before that, I spent best part of a decade at Barclays. So it's a couple of decades working in prudential regulation at major banks in the UK.
Thanks, David. And Peter?
John, thanks for the invitation. So I'm a partner at PwC. I sit in London. I have two roles relevant to this conversation. One is I lead the banking prudential team in the UK. And my second role is I'm a digital partner. So I sponsor a lot of our Gen AI assets and alliances, as well as asset development within the financial services sector.
Fantastic. So as you can see here, we're going to be able to speak about very detailed, precise examples that we're seeing not just from deep within a firm, but also then across other firms as well. And so in order to kind of get that conversation started, David, I'll turn to you first. And so
Sure.
The topic here that we've got is regulatory reporting with AI in practice. So AI, of course, being a very broad space, let alone regulatory reporting itself. But there are some really concrete things that we can talk about within Standard Chartered. And so I'd like you to first share a little bit about where Standard Chartered is today with your regulatory reporting space, and indeed what those ambitions are from where you're standing now, and then maybe how you got to that place to have those ambitions over the past years.
Yeah, sure. So I've been at Standard Chartered, like I said, best part of a decade now. And so when I started, AI was not really a practical term that anyone was using in the business. I think that, like a lot of banks, Standard Chartered faces an environment of rising standards, rising complexity in prudential regulation. We've grappled with much of the same problems that I am familiar with in other places, and it's long been, I mean, it's certainly been my ambition to try and, we're a global bank, we're located in about 60 countries around the world, and it's long been my ambition to try and standardize, centralize, make transparent our operations with regards to the data we bring together, the highly enriched data set we have to use to meet most of our regulatory obligations. And that's been a long journey. I mean, Standard Chartered is an old bank. It's about 150 years old. As that's 150 years of legacy systems, legacy processes, legacy cultures that you're bringing together. And so there's a lot to go to if you want to drag all that stuff together, centralize it, standardize it, make it transparent. But that's certainly where we are today. It's certainly the direction of travel we want to move in. We know that the environment is one where we have to be prepared to make dynamic changes to our processes, to our data collection and mastering. But we also know that the standard keeps going up, right? The goalposts move a lot on the kind of accuracy and integrity and completeness we need to be able to demonstrate to regulators, auditors, those kind of stakeholders.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, as we'll discuss here, one, that constantly moving goalposts means that, while historically techniques that now might be considered quite important to be leveraging might not have been relevant, even if they had technically been available in past decades, and indeed now there are entirely new capabilities which literally wouldn't have existed in the past, which it's now very important to be grappling with, because something that isn't actively being used today by everyone might very well be the standard that regulators are expecting in 5 or 10 years' time. And it can be very painful to suddenly reach that state. Better to be a little bit ahead of it, even if you're not at the very forefront. So I think, Peter, I'll turn to you now and just ask around what you've heard there and how it's resonating in terms of challenges and pain points more broadly across your financial services clients. I imagine what Standard Chartered is facing is not at all uncommon. And so it would be interesting to hear from you both from maybe some of the peer banks, and maybe also if you have some perspectives from some of the slightly different institutions out there.
Yeah, great. Let me share with you a few reflections, but I'll try to zoom in on three things that are really relevant for this conversation in framing where institutions are today. The first is, and I've been doing this for the last decade, and before that had a decade of experience doing financial audits. But basically, the extent of regulation and the volume of regulation has increased tremendously over the years. So, over the last decade, as a minimum, we have a much more complicated regulatory landscape. And for global organizations like Standard Chartered, where they operate in different jurisdictions, that's even amplified. The second thing is all regulators are now looking at reporting as a source of information and data so that they can navigate all the changes that are happening around us, as well as understand how institutions are positioned. And you can only imagine that this is going in one direction, which is with all the things that are happening and all the events that have occurred, Black Swan or other, the regulator is asking for more information, and the regulatory reports are becoming more complicated as time moves on. The third is something you've alluded to, John, and it's very important to understand that technology has always been there, but the opportunity of using technology has varied over the years, and now we're getting to a position where you can see the advancement and you can see how much efficiency and standardization that can provide you outside just really kind of using Excel to automate things, which was the history of where reporting started, to using softwares obviously to do that. But now you can use actually technique and technology techniques to do that. So I hope that paints the picture, which is the actual complexity and challenge is something that exists amongst the peer group, as well as amongst the larger banking organizations that I operate in. But there is this opportunity of using technology to help solve that problem.
Fantastic. Absolutely. So, and I think that's where we'll get now into some of the concrete components. And David, I will return to you here at Standard Chartered. So as we've discussed, technology being at the heart of addressing these challenges, just as it always has been. You have to bring technology to bear to solve this. What that technology specifically looks like in any decade can vary and change. We add new things to the toolkit, other things get replaced. But again, we're always grappling with this technological burden and how to bring it to bear effectively. And so I think in our case, we might want to think about technology from an infrastructure, automation, AI point of view. I imagine we might think of those as three important categories. But overall, be key to hear from you about how Standard Chartered is approaching this. And again, I think you mentioned a little bit that at the heart of all of this, there are still always going to be people involved. So technology itself will always have to have some sense of people, how people are engaging with this technology, how people are being effective, how people are being convinced to leverage it. So I'll turn that rather broad conversation over to you, David. What are you seeing specifically and driving inside of Standard Chartered to resolve these challenges?
Yeah, so I think I guess I think about it in a couple of ways. So there's an external impetus, like Peter was describing. It's a complex regulatory environment, a huge amount of rules. Basically, since the financial crisis, it's been a constant environment of constantly changing prudential rules as regulators grapple with the consequences of the crisis and then subsequent crises that different regional areas have been through. So there's an external impetus. We want to collect more data. The calculations and transformations get more complicated. The data sourcing, risk capture gets more complicated, and so it gets more. And as products evolve and different regulatory regimes develop, you get this overlapping sort of Venn diagram, like this confluence of complexity and change externally. Internally, the business continues to drive towards an environment where we want to optimize our operations. We want to lessen the burden of compliance and regulation on the firms so that we can better service clients. Like, how can we be faster for clients? How can we get outcomes quicker for clients without weighing them down with the weight of risk data capture at the front whenever we're booking a trade or a loan to a client. So those two things are driving you in a certain way into when it comes to platforms, right? We want to capture loads of complex data, and we want to enrich it, and we want to master it in the right way. But at the same time, we want to be fast and we want to be dynamic because we know things are going to change, but we don't want that to impact on clients. We want it to be that it's a seamless experience for clients as much as possible. So those things are driving you into a world where, as Peter said, you're not in an environment anymore where automation means I'm just doing faster what I could have done with a person in an Excel spreadsheet. Now we're talking about many times that level of automation where you're able to look through problems and actually start to look at replacing some of the ways in which we would have done things, not just make things the way we would have done things faster and seem like it would go quicker, but it's basically the same operation started. You just automated a manual operation. And I think that you talked about people, and for me that's one of the most important things. Banks don't have a lot. They've got technology, they've got a couple of buildings, and they've got a load of people. And so a lot of this stuff comes back to the kind of people you have, the developments that those people will need, so that they can continue to be relevant, have relevant careers in a changing world. But also I think like what there's an exciting part, which is what it will unlock for individual people, because I think that I'm sure we'll come and talk about this a bit more later, but some of the nearer term excitements and advantages from newer technologies rests with not replacing all your people, but more that the people that you have will be able to take their careers in different ways, that the skill sets that we would have said were necessary to do reg reporting, which traditionally comes from like a sort of financial control accounting kind of background. Loads of people will be accountants and auditors and stuff like that. That skill set's becoming not that we don't need it anymore, but it's becoming like a part of the overall skill set where we're looking much more at people that have data science and data management expertise, because that's the kind of thing we're being asked to deliver. That's the product you're working on now. It's not so much a template that looks like a balance sheet or a note to the financial accounts. It's now these big cubes of data at a very granular level that you're supposed to be able to extend robust controls over on completeness and accuracy. And so that, of course, that means that the people need to start changing, and you start to see different backgrounds and stuff come into reg reporting. But I think that's like hugely exciting. I mean, Peter will know this. He recruits into this space just like I do. Since the financial crisis, as we've like turned the dial up on complexity, what we've actually done is made it quite hard to add talent into the pool of reg reporting people. The way I know this is like I'm friends with all of them. We swap all our people amongst all the banks. It's long been a problem, right? We don't print more talent. We just sort of swap the same people around. And I think that one of the exciting things about new technology will be what it will do to unlock that door and allow a flood of new talent into the different disciplines in the business that we want, because the barriers to entry will be different. It won't be that you have to have had 20 years like I had, like going through every version of Basel. It's much more that you must be able to work with new technology so that you can like meet the requirements of controlling the vast data sets that we're now in charge of.
Yeah, I think you've really touched on quite a few important things there, and certainly from Dataiku's point of view, and kind of at the heart of our platform, one of the things we are trying to address is that very real challenge of this movement towards what is essentially a data engineering or a data science way of working, with things like data pipelines that can be automated, with automatic tests, with models integrated into a flow of information, often running on some kind of central server. These kind of things would have been very familiar to like a software engineer or some of the data engineering types maybe a decade ago. And now it's kind of the standard way you need to start thinking about things, quite distinct from the way somebody might have been used to thinking about things with Excel, something like that. And indeed, what we've seen is that one way to solve that, and it was the historical way, was to absolutely try to find this relatively small pool of people who could both have the depth of knowledge in the relevant subject matter space and have this very rigorous data science way of thinking. And those people are few. There's more now than there were, but there's still a small number. And so one of the things that we've certainly seen at Dataiku being helpful is introducing solutions like Dataiku, which allow folks to work in these newer ways, these ways of data pipelines and flows of information, but without them having to bring in some of the ancillary skills, like being able to code, for example. One of the things I found very interesting is that there is a number of folks, quite a large share, who, for example, might be subject matter experts on an existing piece of regulatory obligation or work. They might be somewhat comfortable in Excel, but that's the full extent of their analytic capabilities. And they definitely aren't going to be coders. But they are very, very capable of thinking about a process in a pipeline type of way. Often, if you ask them to just take one step out of Excel and rethink what they're doing, they can very immediately describe to you the things they want to do. And I think one of the things you're gesturing towards is there are elements like generative AI components where natural language can generate code for you that performs behaviors. But also, we've found a great deal of success not only with that kind of technology, but with the more straightforward version of providing people with essentially a menu of options and saying, you know, what do you want to connect two data sets together? Do you want to get rid of certain records? Do you want to filter things out? And allowing them to execute those in a manner that's sensible to them, but without them ever having to think about code. So really, I think what you're describing is a really interesting arc that we're in at the moment, where two things are happening at once right now. There are better solutions, better platforms for people to work in, but there's also this entirely new way of working that seems to be on the horizon with generative AI, which is true natural language work. And I think we're at a really interesting place here where both of those are simultaneously available. One of them more established, and then this Gen AI thing more at the edges, and we're still exploring what's going to happen there. So I think with all of that, as you say, in the end, it all ends up being about people. And how are people actually going to work in any of this stuff? How are you actually going to be able to ensure that you have the people that you need and that the people you have available remain impactful? So Peter, one of the things we were going to speak about here was this idea of combining regulation, technology, and how those interact with each other. But I'd be keen, first of all, to get any reaction you have to what David outlined there about people and these kind of ways of working.
Oh, I absolutely agree with David, and we debate this a lot. But so I'll describe it slightly, probably to your point, John, but describe it slightly differently. So people who are interested and understand regulation are technicians. They like to delve into the deep end of the regulation. They understand all the steps that are required. And they are trying to find ways about how you interpret this, etc. That capability and ability of that individual can be easily applied in a low-code software environment to the point that you've said. And I think it's becoming more and more important, not because you have to combine the two to be the best version of yourself, but actually it does eliminate some of the things that our technicians do not like to do. So, for example, you create a flow and you have a lot of complicated regulatory steps along the way within the flow, and you press print and you get a business requirement document. None of the people that I work with or work for us would like to spend their evenings and weekends trying to draft documents about what the flow is doing. So can you imagine that as an incentive for people to do that? And there are so many others, right? Including some of the analytics that David alluded to, which is getting our people to focus on what's important, not actually to continue to build in things that are suboptimal.
And Peter, there's an interesting point that I'd emphasize there, which again goes to this aspect of transformation and rethinking that can sometimes be a little more subtle than people might imagine. Some people think that, oh, if I'm transforming the way of working, it's this kind of very dramatic shift in how everything's being executed, and maybe suddenly now everything's running in the cloud and with code and so on. But actually, there's very subtle, straightforward things that are nonetheless transformative, like what you just said. One of the really interesting things is the ability now that you could build your project and then generate something like a BDR or a technical document describing it at the click of a button. And that initially the reaction to that is, oh, I've saved time not having to create that by hand, which is true. But there's something more transformative happening there that's a little more subtle, which is now that document is a perfect and true representation of what has actually been built. In the past, those documents were attempts to make a perfect representation. They were attempts to sketch a map about a territory. But now you simply are generating an automatic representation that is a true representation at whatever level of abstraction you need of what was actually built. And that's a very interesting change. It's a genuine change that initially might seem disguised or almost less important than the time saved. But actually, this is the kind of world where things start to change a little bit about how you think about these assets, how you think about these audit artifacts, how you even imagine what it would look like to create a chain of custody for a particular project, or what it looks like to audit a project. Now we're starting to look at things where it becomes possible to audit everything rather than simply samples. It becomes possible to do audits on the actual process itself rather than some abstraction of it. And these, again, are transformations that are in the background and they are happening, and we may not really be seeing the full impact of them until 5, 10 or more years down the line, where that concept becomes fully integrated into, for example, a regulator's expectations of how you generate these artifacts in the first place. So I think, again, that's one of the things I'd emphasize for the group here and for those listening, is this idea of keeping an eye out for what transformation truly is, and that it needn't be quite as dramatic as you might imagine at first glance, while still having a very substantial transformative impact. So Peter, one of the things, though, that I did interrupt you as you were kind of moving forward therein is I wanted to make sure that we did talk about, from your perspective, this regulatory technology intersect. So what is it that you're seeing happening in the space from PwC's angle?
Yeah, I think if we step back and look where organizations are, I've talked about the increased regulation. I've talked about the complexity of reporting, and we talked about people a bit. But try to combine them all together. What the pressure point today is, you cannot continue to increase teams to address increased regulatory requirements, as well as to be able to kind of respond to the regulator with, on every return. Either they ask for methodically or they ask for in an ad hoc basis. So that's the fundamental play here, which is you not only actually won't be able to expand your team significantly to do that, but you need to even operate more efficiently the teams that you have, so that they focus on analyzing and not just on producing. And that interplay is becoming very, very important in the environment we are in, which is a highly regulated environment, highly complicated set of products, as well as set of returns. And this is why technology is fundamental to us today. So we cannot operate like we did 10 years ago, where you can just say, I'll get 5 people, they can respond to a capital return, and I can submit to the regulator. They'll come back to me with questions after a month. No, actually, you have to do all your checks and balances beforehand automatically. You have to analyze, you have to use the most efficient way. When regulation change, you have to comply immediately with the regulation, and et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that gives you a picture, or paints a picture of why I see them fundamental as in regulation technology, and why I encourage my team to adopt both as part of their career progression.
Indeed, and as I was just mentioning, and I'll emphasize again, if for those who might feel that is sounds like cutting edge thinking, or that sounds like a future oriented thinking, remember that some firms are much further along than others here, and that there will come a very clear point where it will be the expectation that will come to your door. And it would be very unwise to find yourself unready at that moment. That is when we see firms having these colossal, expensive struggles to meet needs, where an expectation that had been slowly kind of increasing and increasing and increasing suddenly reaches a tipping point, and you find yourselves underprepared. That needn't be the case. But as you say, this ongoing investment and understanding of technology is the way to ensure that doesn't happen. A problem where you cannot simply throw more bodies at it to solve it. Those are always going to be around the corner, and technology is the way that you would ensure that issue doesn't hit you square. So I think, speaking of all of this, I think, David, what we'll turn now is to talking in some real detail, I would hope, from your side and then from Peter's, around the actual specific work that was handled inside of Standard Chartered, bringing together, in this particular case, Dataiku and PwC with the Standard Chartered team. But I was keen for us to speak a little bit about, we've been talking here, about technologies and this idea of transformation and of its various forms and ways of working. But what was some specific work that we could talk about here for people to really think about and see as the kind of thing that they should be imagining on their own side?
Sure. So let's talk specifically about the project and the initiative that Dataiku and PwC and Standard Chartered are working on. So PwC have long been our partners here to support the management with standards on reg reporting and changing regulatory environment, and they've sort of been with us as we've tried to redress. We've had regulatory investigations, which have been public. We've had Section 166 audits, just like all the banks in the UK have. So high amount of investigation and scrutiny, and PwC have been our partners in supporting on that. And we specifically in this particular use case, we were looking for, to meet a regulatory audit requirement, we were looking for a tool to help us check some of our regulatory transformations. So literally, like, are we in compliance with the calculations in the PRA rulebook? And why Dataiku? So as a, like, not to insult you, John, but as a practitioner, like, I'm kind of technology agnostic. I want the right tool for the right job, right? I don't really mind about what the brand name is. But Dataiku has an existing relationship with Standard Chartered. We use it in other places in financial reporting and control. In particular, as someone that's like trying to like bring in a technology, in particular, our technology department like the fact that it's flexible, that it's compatible, that it will talk to a lot of existing, because like a lot of other big firms and big banks, we are an amalgamation of legacy platforms, some of them in-house developed and some of them vendor built on that, and anything that does not meet our requirement for being compatible and flexible with those things is always going to be a hard road to go. So and Dataiku meets those requirements, which is really why we're talking about using Dataiku in this particular use case here, I think. And then what we're building together, PwC are using their expertise. They've done it with other of our peers to bring in this kind of reperformance and quality assurance style capability. And so what we're doing is we've spun up a program which is in flight. We're already like part of the way through it this year, where I've got people from Peter's team, people from my team that have we've hired and appointed specifically to work on this reperformance and quality assurance team, and then support from the Dataiku team to basically code in the rules to consume our data in the format in which it's available, which is like in my view, it's the hardest part, and literally check ourselves. I'm running a very, very complicated data enrichment and calculation process on a monthly basis. Is that how close is that to the vanilla version of the rules? How reconcilable is it to a sort of like a simple reading of what the instructions say you should do? And that's literally what we're doing. We've started doing it in sections. So we've looked at a certain asset class. We start with all of our sovereign counterparties to start with. Standard Chartered has got complicated and vast sovereign counterparty relationships. We operate in lots of countries, like I said earlier. All of those countries will have sovereign relationships with across a wide footprint. So some of them will be much more complicated in terms of history modeling, data capture than the Americas or Western Europe. So we've got a huge base there, and so there's lots of complexity and lots to work with. And we're literally working everyone side by side, which is by far and away my preferred approach. I think that the best outcome here is not that we are buying a tool like a can opener, or that Peter's going to tell me it's all right and I can go phew and wipe my brow and walk off and not worry about it anymore, but more that we're collectively, so Peter's team, my team, we're doing things that perhaps we won't have done before, but we're building it together. Everyone gets something out of it. So we will use Dataiku in a way that Dataiku not been used before, and Peter's team will build something that they've got some experience of doing something similar, but not this exact thing. And my team will learn how to do this kind of quality assurance discipline with a newer kind of technology they don't have experience with. Everyone will come out of it richer for it. And importantly for me, crucially for me, the immediate ask. So let's be clear. Everything gets funded because there's a requirement, right? So I've got a regulator asks for a specific thing, so I can get the funding for it. But the solution that we've chosen, this kind of partnership, is for me is crucial, because if you're spending this kind of money, you're making this kind of investment, it's got to be in a way that you don't just meet your immediate requirement, but you're opening the door to more potential in the future. What could we do with it in the future? And that for me is the most exciting thing, and the most important thing, because it's the way that I can be sustainable. All the evidence, and Peter's got lots of experience from his other clients and stuff, all the evidence is you can't just all the banks go through some sort of remediation. You get an audit, you get an investigation, we get something to do, and we do the action and we close it down. but the rules change next year, and then the requirement changes next year, and so you're out of date almost instantly. You've got to think about it less in terms of point in time to point in time, and much more in terms of building capabilities. And I see this particular activity as a step change in capability. We will be able to do things that we were not able to do before with people that will have skill sets that they did not have before. And that combination of things means that it's a worthwhile investment. I'm not just closing down the immediate ask, I'm also looking to the future and what might be around the corner, because what we all know, if you look at like the recent history of regulation, is we don't know exactly what's going to happen next, but you do know that something's going to happen, something's going to change, there's going to be some new requirement, there's going to be some new standard to hit. So we've got to have that capability inbuilt. We've got to keep pushing ourselves to the edge. You talked a bit earlier about you don't have, it doesn't have to be like the bleeding cutting edge, but a lot of regulation hitting the standards is about understanding where our peers are, where regulators' expectations are, and making sure we're constantly keeping pace. When I first started in banking, like a few decades ago, I would never have called up like a colleague at HSBC or another bank and said, like, what are you guys doing about this? We considered our regulatory operations and interpretation a competitive advantage. That is all history. We are all just trying to be compliant with the rules and keeping the compliance with each other. I regularly catch up with my colleagues at all the other banks. Like we all know each other. We have a WhatsApp group together, and we're always talking about what's the what are you guys doing? How are we going to get there? What standard are we trying to hit now? Because we know that part of hitting the right standard is staying in the pack. So to your point earlier about adopting new ways of working and new technologies, you've got to do it to stay in the pack. There's a rising standard and rising standards, rising complexity, and everyone else is doing it too. It doesn't mean you have to be the very, very best, and we don't have to do something like amazing. And indeed, I would argue that the more you moonshoot for some of these solutions, the less credible it sounds to some of your outside stakeholders. If the regulator says, "Oh, you've got these 5 actions to do," and I say, "Don't worry, AI will take care of that," they'll look at me and say, "Will it really?" So it's got to be grounded and realistic, and it's got to be achievable, and you've got to understand it crucially. But you do have to take action. The sort of sitting around and hoping that someone else will show me the way isn't like that. The companies are quite different, even though we're regulated in similar standards. And so you've got to know what capabilities other people are building so that you can keep pace.
Yeah, I think you've covered that in some excellent depth, and the point you're making there, I think there's quite a few pieces there worth drawing out. And I think one of the most important to emphasize is this idea that it isn't a series of one-shot actions that you then walk away from. You have to have this continuous mindset. And that's kind of, I think people instinctively understand that now, even though historically kind of older approaches are still around, where this instinct might be to just try to constantly solve them with these one-shot things and then hope that does you for 5 years or something. But in reality, that's long gone. That's not really how this works anymore. And yes, you not only need to be able to deliver something that is going to be flexible enough for you yourselves to then continue to enrich and update, but also that level of expectation from the regulator that you yourself should be able to explain to them in precise detail about precisely how this works and why it solves that problem. Also very much an expectation now that in the past there could have been a little bit more hand waving or a little bit more of like, oh yes, well, we use this standard approach or this thing off the shelf. There's also, I think, again, if we think about this idea of a transformed way of thinking and working, what we're describing here would be extremely familiar to a software engineer from 10 or 20 years ago. Of course, you build a piece of software and then you continue to update it. You release a version and then you release an updated version, in their case, in response often to consumer demand. And here we're facing not simply the consumer and client demand, but also this very heavy regulatory demand. But the reaction has to be the same, one of being flexible. And so now we are adopting, again, these concepts of software engineering and development, which are not new. They've been around for a very long time in the world, but they're quite new in our space. And the good news about that, though, is that as a result, we don't have to adopt whole cloth the particular ways of working that appear in a software engineering firm. We can simply take other tools and ways of working that are effective and efficient for what we're trying to do, take the best of those kinds of concepts and embody them in a way of working that will allow us to deliver value given the skills and knowledge that we have. And again, that I think making sure that that balance is struck is, I think, where some firms in perhaps maybe 5 to 10 years ago were struggling a bit. This idea that we suddenly had to all become technology companies, or we all suddenly had to think about hiring only software people, or coders. I think now that there's become this much more realistic sense that, well, we actually know what we're trying to achieve. And it's more about a way of working and thinking and approaching a problem rather than some very specific piece of tech or very specific skill set that we have to bring. So Peter, I'd love to hear from your side. What's that looked like from you, both in terms of this particular work with Standard Chartered, and then more generally, maybe what you're also seeing at other firms.
Thanks, John. And I'll reflect on a few things, but let me start. That partnership approach of trying to solve the problem together is fundamental, because what you will see is this is where it starts. You have to kind of trust that you can solve a problem together, and you have to get all the different expertise that exists from around in this case, we had Dataiku, we had ourselves, we had Standard Chartered, to try to bring all these different skill set and expertise to achieve that. Now, the second thing is the continuous development, and really that capability concept is so fundamental. I've seen it from my team when we started investing in developing these solutions. It was, 5+ years ago, where if we didn't start on that journey at that time, we would have not achieved the sophistication we have today. And it's very difficult to achieve that overnight. And therefore, that partnership model and making sure that you get the capability transferred, i.e. just condense years of experience and give training that's specific to these individuals so that they can stand on their own feet and they can proceed on that journey, is effectively, that the key thing that we are aiming with Standard Chartered, and I aim with most of my clients in this scenario. But last but not least, when we think of why this evolution is necessary, it is necessary because it's almost, we're walking a path where a lot of inputs are coming all the time from regulation and or technology advancement. And if you don't consider all these inputs, you will miss opportunities along the way to get to a better state than where you are, or become more efficient. And this is why we keep an eye from PwC perspective on all these changes that are happening, both on the regulatory side as well as on the technology side.
Fantastic. And so I think extending from that, let's think a little bit about where we're at the moment in this kind of technology space. So David, I'd pivot back to you here. At the moment, there are many technologies to be leveraged, some of which are classic pieces of technology that have been around for a very long time. I mean, there's nothing that beats a good join, an advanced VLOOKUP now and again will solve a lot of your problems. Nothing like a fuzzy match to try to resolve some data issues, or some good automated metrics on your data quality. Again, these are not fancy new things, although if you do them in an efficient, effective way with more of a data pipeline mindset, they can be transformative in terms of the actual impact on the business. But what I'd be keen to hear from you, David, is let's think more in this kind of what we might think the broadest AI, including generative AI space. Are there particular features or capabilities that you're observing now that you think are quite intriguing when it comes to this kind of regulatory reporting journey? Things that you're beginning to see emerging that either you've already been able to see a little bit of impact from, or that you would expect to soon?
Yeah, I think that the most exciting, I think, near-term, more immediate applications that I see, like we've actually deployed or are in the process of deploying, come to do with basically doing what we were doing before, but just a bit better and a bit more effectively. So you mentioned earlier, like nothing beats a good fuzzy match. I love a fuzzy match. When I used to do manual repo calculations at Barclays years ago, but we're rolling out some AI to basically do a better fuzzy match for us. So we were trying to enhance the data quality on some of our counterparty IDs. We're talking about funds with like names that all look very similar with numbers and stuff at the back of them, and and we're trying to work, is it the same counterparty, a different counterparty, how do these counterparties link? We're talking about places where the counterparty name might be in a Korean or Chinese character rather than in the alphabet that we'll use in English. And so you've got lots of challenges there, and by using, our fuzzy matching was producing a result that was probably about in the sort of like 70 to 80%, and by using a new AI tool, we're able to get up to sort of like the 98, 99% kind of matching. It's not very complicated, and it's not very it's more that it's more effective in execution. So it's not mind-blowing technology that wow, I could never think of anything that could do this. It's just better than what we have today. It gets you an efficiency that's much better. It removes the need to manual intervention. It frees up more time for real world analysis and control, rather than like going back over trying to manually plug in gaps because your automated process left you with so many holes at the end of it. So that, and I see a lot of that going on right now, right through to we're in the process of looking at variations on a Copilot theme, right? So I use Excel, I use Azure or whatever, and I can just make my coding or my macro a little bit faster because the suggestion gets prompted to me rather than people writing it up. Plus, you have the knowledge that it's the best formula for what you're trying to do, and it's more likely to drag down to the bottom of your range rather than, oh, I forgot it, I just rolled it forward from last time and I've chopped off the bottom 50 rows off my spreadsheet. So that kind of like Copilot approach, where it doesn't mean that you look up and I've got an operations where we'll have like a few hundred people running financial operations for reg calculations and reporting. You don't look up and see that's all been replaced by a robot. Instead, you look up and you find that the same people are able to do loads more. So my team currently produce about 600,000 data items that we report to the regulator every quarter. How much do we pass through statistical analytical review of those 600,000 data items? Not very many, right? Like maybe like 100 or 200. And with some of the AI and some simple like ML technology that we're bringing out now, we're able to analytically interrogate almost all of them. That's what we're heading for, right? We'll be able to get coverage and we'll be able to say, actually, we run controls over all the data items we submit to you, not just the totals, because it was too hard to get to the rest of it. So that sort of Copilot theme is very much in the near term. In the long term, we are looking at using proper generative AI solutions for things. So I've just got done completing a project with my policy team where, because Standard Chartered's got big bases in Singapore and Hong Kong, we have done an exercise where with the new Basel regulations coming, Basel 3.1, we've done manual analysis where we're looking at the differences in the rules between what's in the UK, what was in the Basel rules, and what's going to be in Hong Kong under the HKMA and Singapore under the MAS. So we do line by line, and we look at the differences in the gap analysis, all produced with like skilled SMEs and taking a lot of time, very resource intensive. The next phase of that, we're looking to perhaps do with a large language model where we can bring in many, many more regulatory regimes so we can have much more in-depth analysis. But also we'll break down things which have been blocked off to us before. So this set of regulations is all in Chinese, so we didn't have an English version. So that put a blocker to, because I don't have all languages in my reg policy team. I've got some, but I don't have all of them.
Right.
And all of a sudden you start to see how it gives you an analytical basis to start from. Not that it removes the need for SMEs to look at things, and obviously people will still need to be at the heart of it, but that it just like massively increases people's the useful time they can spend on analysis. I've literally had people on my team where they're saying to me, I want to look at these two PDFs for these two rules, but the PDFs are so big they won't load properly, so it keeps crashing. So I open one and I copy some of the text out from one chapter and then I compare it to other. All of that stuff goes away, right? How slow it was to execute on the work there, how much that's not value add time. This is like someone with like 15 years of like regulatory policy stuff, and they're copying and pasting out of PDF documents they downloaded off the internet. We've cut through all that kind of stuff, and that person's then able to spend all their time looking at, oh, this is highlighted as a difference. Is it really a difference? Like, how much of a difference is it? How much of a difference is it for our business, for our clients? Like, how much difference does it make for us individually? And that's where the value add comes. You're able to cut through. And you were talking about earlier about, I thought it was really interesting about when you were talking about mapping process flows and data flows, and you said it's a change in capability because it's what actually happened. I feel the same way. So you don't bring your own biases or your own reading to things, which when we're looking at regulations that might be based in different translations and different cultures, it's absolutely essential that we don't bring any of that bias with us when we do the analysis, and don't bring any of your own history, because one of my guys will have worked in the German regulator and will bring that sensibility with them and that prejudice with them when they're analysing rules that are in Korea, but perhaps that's not appropriate. And you can cut straight through that, and it's only the evidence of what's in there. And not to mention, like with data flows, like with any kind of analysis, it is always easier to iterate when it's not a blank sheet of paper. The hardest thing to do is to start from scratch. And if anyone or anything can make up that difference, and we start with something and we can iterate off it, you're instantly off to a flyer when it comes to actual operations and actual execution.
Yeah, I think you've touched on two really important points there that I want to draw out. The first is that last point there around seeding the ground. So yes, these generative AI components are really introducing a way of starting from not just a blank piece of paper. And indeed, that really does allow you to begin work in a very sensible way. And there's a subcomponent there, of course, which is that there's still always a person in the loop. I can say consistently across the work that we've seen in the entirety of the financial services space, all of these impactful Gen AI models, there's always a person involved somewhere. Now, that person might be potentially operating dramatically more efficiently than they were before, or they might be interacting with the process at a different point than they were before. They might have cut out some busy work, or they might have cut out some work that was required them to engage quite heavily, but wasn't really where their best value add was. But that person is still always there because you're always having to make sure that there's somebody accountable and that there is that practical human insight to ensure that whatever is being produced is actionable. The other thing I'd want to draw attention to is that very first example you gave of using generative AI simply to enhance a fuzzy matching approach. Again, a perfect example of how generative AI's capabilities are really very impressive in certain spaces, like, for example, entity resolution and the ability to attach context to an entity, which then allows you to solve a problem. And yet, at the end, if you were to describe what had happened, it's a very simple story. You had an existing level of efficiency of 70% for a fuzzy matching process. Now the efficiency is 98%. At no point in time did some kind of incredible AI robot appear and tell people some amazing story. All that happened is you took a process and you dramatically improved its efficiency. But again, you didn't go from 70% to literally 100%. You didn't completely automate the process. There's always going to be little edge cases still, but you achieved a level of improvement in efficiency, which is very notable, definitely drives value, and you used generative AI to do it. But it's straightforward. It's very easy to describe to somebody. You could have just said, I used a better algorithm. And somebody would have been like, great, good job on the better algorithm. I'm glad that we're at a much higher efficiency rate. Generative AI doesn't have to be a buzzword in this case. It's techniques and capabilities that, if used in an appropriate context, can be very, very impactful today. And again, from our point of view at Dataiku, our mission is very much to make that as straightforward as possible to do. So we just see generative AI as another part of your toolkit. You need to make sure that it's well governed and controlled so that people use it appropriately. So we offer that aspect of our LLM mesh around governance and control, but simultaneously, we want to make it as straightforward once you're in that governed space to apply it to a problem. Just like it would be perfectly reasonable for someone nowadays doing a fuzzy match to expect to have access to some of the basic fuzzy matching algorithms like Levenstein distance. Maybe 20 or 30 years ago, that would have seemed very ambitious to say like, oh, I need to use an algorithm. People would have just said, no, just use a lookup table or something. But it's perfectly normal for someone to want to have access to reasonable algorithms that do this work well. And nowadays, those happen in some cases to be generative AI models that do it well. So again, making these available to people, allowing them to do it efficiently is a reasonable thing. And there's very straightforward value add that can be achieved there. So Peter, I'd love to turn it to you in terms of what are you seeing in the space that are allowing people to move this work forward, and what are you kind of seeing people working on now and expecting to see in the coming months?
Yeah, I share both your reflections on some of the points mentioned there, but I'll take it a different direction. So when my clients come to me and start to ask me about that, they start to ask me about the broader solution. So how can you solve a broader problem? So an example of that, and we talked about the quality assurance. So it's about regulation, regulatory calculation, and reporting. So how can you solve that broader aspect or broader problem? And the reality is this is where you have a solution with different components, some more on the Gen AI front and some more on the simple automation front. And that's where what we're saying a lot more is I spend time with my clients to just think through that. What is the exam question here? What is the solution that solves that exam question? And what techniques do you use where? Because in some instances, you want accuracy and completeness. You don't go to predictive. So in other instances, actually, you want the starter for 10. Absolutely, you can go down that route. So you see that. And just to bring it to life with a specific example, I mean, in addition to the solutions we build around regulation, one thing to just bring it to everybody here, you can take a regulation, a global regulation, as much content as you'd like, you can point a large language model to try to help you to bucket that thematically, to translate that, to get you down to an obligation so that you know exactly what you'll need to comply with. You can then use large language models to actually predict what is the process that you need to have, what is the risk, what are the controls. Actually, take it a step further. What are the test scripts of these controls? All in the context that it gives you, it generates ideas and it gives you steps, and you need a human in the loop. But all of these are possibilities today that didn't exist, 10 years ago. It was more download in a spreadsheet, take it line by line, try to assess it one by one. I mean, that will support, my clients and firms who are grappling with this today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, we're coming back very consistently to this idea that, and it's very much at the heart of Dataiku's philosophy, it's why our platform's end-to-end, which is you solve a problem in the appropriate way for the problem and for the context. Sometimes that's simple, sometimes it's complex, sometimes it involves 1 or 2 steps, sometimes it involves 20 or 30 steps. Sometimes you need to have some kind of interactive element to it. Sometimes it's just a pure automation that runs in the background. And many of these things all need to be connected into each other. Projects get connected to other projects that get connected to others. And so again, this is the right way to approach problems. Don't try to solve everything with Gen AI. Don't try to solve everything with a dashboard, but you definitely want to have access to these and many other capabilities simultaneously in order, if you're going to solve a suite of problems that you're faced with at any particular time. And again, I think most importantly, that I think what we have emphasized here is the need to always be able ultimately to iterate. You will always need to return to the work that you've done, or you'll need to be able to do rapid ad hoc work that's very quick to spin up and then you can move on from. And this capability is something that I think firms are becoming increasingly confident with. They're becoming more and more capable of, and they're also realizing that they really are a necessity if they're going to be able to be effective. So I think to finish this up, first of all, David and Peter, thank you so much for the time. I think this is a great conversation. David, I'd love to give you, and then Peter, just a closing remark, anything in particular you'd like to highlight, or anything in particular that you'd like to emphasize for folks in the space that they could take away and something for them to think about concretely.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that probably things that I've learned from doing this work and how it's changed in our space and in my discipline in particular over the years. What I'd say is that what you were mentioning earlier, I think is right. Like it's important that we don't lose touch with what's going on. And I think thinking about tools like AI as something different to just keeping touch with how the standards are moving and how rules are changing is probably wrong, right? It's just the latest in many things that if you work in any kind of regulation, any kind of industry, or if you're working in banking in particular, like you've always had to keep touch with what's going on. You've always had to know where the industry is moving, and this is no different to that. Just like we would in most disciplines in business, I think that it's important that we always keep an understanding of what's actually happening and what's going on. It doesn't mean the same thing as being able to build your own algorithm or understand all the coding, but it is important to understand how you're deploying your tools and in what the framework is. I think keeping control is paramount as we progress through all these things. Ultimately, if anyone holds a role that's anything like mine, if something goes wrong, someone's going to come and ask you why it went wrong and what went on, what happened. You need to be able to answer that question at all times. So it's really important that you don't get lost in the new tools that come out and thinking that, I've got to chase down something new. As you were saying earlier, the practical examples are not like that. It is basically being more efficient in the short term with what you have right now. And the last thing I'd say is that I don't think that any of I think that keeping the human context in place is crucial for me. What is it that you need? What is it your teams need in the future to stay relevant? And what opportunities are there for it? So because I work in the back office in compliance, we often think it's often a defensive strategy, like how can I make it like less painful, cheaper, faster? But really, like you have to think about it from an opportunistic point of view as well. What am I going to get out of this? And for me, a lot of that comes back down to people. I genuinely believe that different practices in working, which I think that's what technology will unlock for us as we go forward, and not millions of miles into the future, but very, very soon, will allow us to have different kinds of people, and the existing people have different kinds of careers than they had before. And I think that's really exciting. I think that means you'll get diversity of thought, you'll get diversity of talent in a way that we would have been locked out of. And I think for me, that's the main thing. Technology unlocks that barrier that was stopping different kinds of talent flowing freely between different kinds of company and different kinds of disciplines. And actually, it makes things much. You talked about you might have a certain mindset, but I'm not a coder, so how can I get into it? And now all of a sudden I've got a tool that lets me work in that space. And I see that a lot with even things like regulation itself. Like, it doesn't matter so much that, like I do, the last 20 years of every time they changed a full stop in a European regulation. Instead, now those barriers are knocked down for you, or they are being knocked down right now, and that will allow talent to flow more freely. And I think that's really exciting. That for me, that's the key. People that are in my team, they can go and do some other things. People that aren't in my team, but at the moment could never ever get in there. Now the door's open, right? Like, the door is becoming open. You can get in there because technology is unlocking those barriers.
That's great. And I think, again, excellent to always return back to the people involved here, and that this is going to be at the heart of the work, and with the technology enabling that. Peter, I think we'll give it to you as a final kind of thing for people to take away before we close out the conversation.
Yes, I would like to highlight a point, people point again, but applies for organizations more generally. It's how do you assess evolution, and what do you need to do? So, when you reflect on, each one of us on our careers or on our people's careers, how things evolve for us. It evolved gradually. It evolved when every time you took one step forward to learn one new thing, and then you build from there. And then suddenly, if you look back, you'd be like, wow, this has been a long journey. And it's in regulation, it's in technology, it's in personal lives, like, the mobiles we use today and the devices. So I feel if I leave, one last thought with people is just think about personally how you are evolving day in, day out, but think about how you're evolving people around you as well. And that includes infrastructure, data systems, not a different question to ask, but that evolutionary journey is what I'd leave everybody with.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So, David, Peter, thank you so much for joining us. I've been John McCambridge from Dataiku. It's been an absolute pleasure. So, thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.